Hi, welcome to the first of several videos dealing with ancient Greek philosophy, largely the work of Plato, but we wanted to look at a few of the other characters that were influential on him as well. So I wanted to start off today with just a quick overview of ancient Greek philosophy. And as we can see from the screen here, ancient Greek philosophy is divided up into three major areas: the pre-Socratics, the classical period, and the Hellenistic period. Now, the pre-Socratics, obviously, as the name implies, come before the time of Socrates. And while there are quite a few of them that are interesting to look at, I'm going to look specifically at two. One is Heraclitus, who lives from 535 to 470 BC, and the other is Pythagoras, who lives from 570 to 495. The reason why I'm looking at these two is because they are very influential on the views of Plato that you're going to be studying. The Sophists are a group of individuals that are mentioned in Plato's writings. They are not philosophers in their own right. They are more individuals who are concerned with rhetoric, with manipulating language. They are sort of the lawyers of the day. And this is important to be familiar with simply because at one point Socrates is accused of being a sophist, and he has to mount the defense that he is not. Now, after the pre-Socratic period, we come to the classical period. This is a brief element of time, only maybe 150 years at most, but it is a crucial period because this is where the most predominant thinkers are going to be from. And so you have Socrates, who lives from 470 to 399, Plato from 428 to 347, and Aristotle from 384 to 322. Socrates is one of those figures that's known by pretty much everybody. He's a cultural icon, but yet almost nothing that we know of him comes from any source other than the writings of Plato. There are a few other minor places that mention him, but really what we know of him comes from the writings of Plato. He left no specific record of his own. He left no writings of his own. Plato is sort of that great figure who is the autobiographer of Socrates, but he's also a prominent philosopher in his own right, introducing very important theories such as the theory of the forms, which is going to be dominant down through the history of philosophy. And Aristotle, of course, becomes a crucial figure as well, the student of Plato. And Aristotle will be responsible for really developing a lot of new theories, a lot of new ideas in philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, clearly in epistemology as well. His theories of knowledge are very important for us, developing an alternate version of the theory of the forms. Aristotle creates formal logic. So Aristotle is a very prominent, very important person whose influence is going to be felt down towards the present day. After the death of Aristotle, we enter into what's called the Hellenistic period, which runs from the death of Aristotle up through the end of the 1st century AD. And Aristotle, his influence, along with the influence of the Greek world in general, comes to dominate much of the Mediterranean. And because of that, this is a period where the Greek philosophy, the Greek culture, the Greek language becomes the dominant force all throughout what would be at the time the Roman Empire, or what would become the Roman Empire. We won't deal much with the Hellenistic period, but as I said, I do want to look at these pre-Socratics today. I want to start with Heraclitus. Heraclitus is an interesting character. Like most of these pre-Socratics, though, we don't know a whole lot about their life. Their writings only survive in fragmented form, so we don't have a lot of great information about them. We can't read their work directly. But Heraclitus is a very important figure in that he develops two theories that are going to be very influential on the development of Plato. One, which is talked about on this screen, he says the world is in constant flux. The world that we're living in is a world that is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. It's subject to entropy. So this world that we're living in is never permanent. It's never stable. And that's a problem because the ancient Greek philosophers believed that the only time that there should ever be change or movement is when there's something wrong that needs to be fixed. Permanence and stability was the natural order of things. If we were going to discover knowledge, knowledge had to be of something that was absolute and perfect and unchanging. But yet, when we look at this world, according to Heraclitus, there is nothing in this world that's permanent and absolute and unchanging. Everything is in a state of constant flux. Heraclitus has had attributed to him this phrase, which, as far as we know, he doesn't actually say, but it's been attributed to him to explain his theory. You cannot step in the same river twice. And initially, a person might look at that and think, well, that's rather strange, because, I mean, if I were to go out to the Ohio River and go into it, back out, back into it, back out again, then haven't I stepped in the same river twice? Well, you have, in the sense that this is what we've chose to call this thing. But the river itself is not the same river from the first instance to the second, because the water is flowing downstream. As it does so, the sediment along the bottom is shifting and changing. And so we're never at that point where we can say absolutely that it is the Ohio River. That river is always evolving and changing and altering itself. And so from one moment to the next, it's not the same river. So this world is a world of flux. And Plato is going to wholeheartedly believe that. This world that we're living in, there is nothing that is absolute within it. Heraclitus also gives us another very prominent, very important theory called the unity of opposites theory. When we look at the world, we find that there are opposites that come into play. There is male and female. There is day and night. There is life and death, and so on. And when Heraclitus looks at opposites, he says that opposites are united in three specific ways. First, opposites become opposites. We can watch as day becomes night. We can watch as life becomes death. We see opposites becoming their opposite. Secondly, he says opposites are co-originating and codependent. Now, I look at this essentially as a linguistic argument. If we take, for example, day and night, we could imagine, I suppose, that there was a world in which it was always what we call daylight, that there was never a moment when the sun stopped shining, when there was never that moment of darkness. It did not exist. Now, the thing is, though, that if we did live in a world like that, we wouldn't call that state of affairs daytime. The only reason we call it daytime is because we have that opposite state of affairs when it goes dark. And that means that we have to have the ability to differentiate the one from the other. So I can look at the one side and say it's daytime. I can look at the other state and say it's nighttime. They coexist. I only need one without the other. There's an old story in the Chinese philosophies about a fish. And this fish, somehow people are able to talk to the fish. And anyway, the fish is asked, well, what is it like to live all of your life in water? And the fish said, what's water? Because it's the only thing it's ever known, it doesn't need a name for it. If it were to experience another form of existence, then it would need a name for what it is. Okay? So opposites are co-originating. They come into existence side by side. They depend upon each other for their existence. There is no light without dark. There is no life without death, and so on. And thirdly, the one that really kind of baffles a lot of people, he says opposites are identical. In other words, they're part of the same cycle. They're part of the same movement. When we look at life and death, or if we look at day and night, there is something that is underlying that metamorphosis. There's something that's underlying that change. So we have a transitional period that's taking place. But the opposites are really just two sides of the same coin, right? You bring out a coin, and on one side you've got a face, on the other side you've got some other insignia. So you have the front and the back of the coin, the heads and the tails. But it's still only one coin. And opposites, he says, are exactly the same way. If we look at day and night, then what is it that causes that? Well, it's the movement of the heavenly bodies. It's part of that cycle that causes it to occur. If we look at life and death, the argument could be made that it's the soul that is transitioning from one state to another, but that soul is what is the underlying entity. But opposites are essentially the same thing. They're just two sides of the same coin. So Heraclitus gives us this argument of the unity of opposites, and we'll see when we get into Plato's arguments in the Phaedo that he relies very, very heavily on this unity of opposites argument in making his case. The other thinker that I wanted to look at is Pythagoras. Pythagoras is a really interesting individual in his own right. In addition to being a philosopher, he of course is a mathematician. Most people who know the name of Pythagoras know it through math, the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's him. But he was also a religious cult leader. Now keep in mind that when we use the word cult today, it has a lot of negative connotations, and we think of people going off in compounds somewhere and drinking Kool-Aid. But originally, the idea of cult just simply meant that it was a group of people who shared similar ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and so on. Originally, Christianity was a cult of Judaism. So there's nothing negative involved in this. But Pythagoras was a religious cult leader. He advocated a lot of views that you find later on in medieval monasteries, things like celibacy, things like a vegetarian diet. He was very, very much involved in that type of thing, leading a very aesthetic life. Now, Pythagoras, in terms of his philosophy, is again very influential on Plato, because, as I said before, Plato and all the ancient Greeks believed that real knowledge had to be knowledge that was permanent and stable and absolute and unchanging. But that nothing in this world was like that. This world is a world of constant flux and change. So with that being the case, Pythagoras comes along and says, but there is something that's absolute. Mathematics, numbers, right? You may have heard the phrase, only in mathematics do we find truth. Well, Pythagoras says something along those lines. And he tells us also, as you see on the screen here, numbers are the eternal reality that underlie the changing world of appearance. When we look at numbers, numbers are absolute. Numbers do not change. Why? Because they're not physical things existing in this world. Numbers are concepts that exist only mentally. Now, it's true that if we take a number, say the number 2, we can write that number in various ways. We can do it in Arabic numerals, we can do it in Roman numerals, we could do it like pips of a die, we could write the word out, we could write the word out in different languages, we could come up to a different symbol to stand for it, but none of those things are actually the number 2. The number 2 is being represented by those changing entities, that scribble that I can put on the board and erase. But when it comes down to it, the concept behind it is what is real. That concept behind it is absolute. And so what two really is, the idea very simply that if I take one thing and another thing and I stick them together, I get those two things, that's never going to change. That's absolute. And so only in mathematics are we going to find those absolutes. Well, again, Plato is going to look at what Pythagoras gives us here, and he's going to say yes, because numbers are mental activity only, because they exist in the mind, not in the physical world. They are absolute, unchanging entities. And that leads Plato to believe that, well, maybe there are other things that are also absolute, unchanging entities too. And this is what's going to lead largely to the theory of the forms that we'll be discussing later. And so this brings us to the figure of Socrates. As I said earlier, Socrates is an individual that we don't really know anything about other than what Plato tells us. But one of the things we learn from Socrates is that he gives us a quote that's become sort of synonymous with philosophy, and that is that the unexamined life is not worth living. What Socrates wants us to do, what establishes sort of the ground rules of philosophy, is that we shouldn't just be going through the motions of existence. We shouldn't just be living our lifetime in this way. We should be thinking about it, examining it, questioning it, trying to learn from it. And so Socrates is going to develop a very unique way of doing philosophy, what we now call Socratic method. And what Socrates does, he doesn't set up a school, he doesn't teach classes or anything of that nature. He simply goes out into the streets and he begins talking with people. And he'll start by asking them a very simple sounding question. What is justice? What is piety? What is knowledge? And he always professes ignorance. He always says, I don't know what these things are. I'm just trying to discover for myself. I'm trying to understand what these things are. Can you help me? And some interlocutor is going to come along and say, well, of course, Socrates, I'll tell you what those things are. And he'll give him his whole explanation. And then Socrates will say, well, that's interesting, but, and then dismantle the whole guy's argument in front of his face. Socrates will then ask the question again. Somebody else will try to interact, and he'll do the same thing. What Socrates is trying to do is really twofold. First, he's hoping to find individuals who are willing to just say, I don't know, which is actually a very difficult thing. To say, I don't know, to a question that seems so obvious. We use words like justice and knowledge all the time. What do you mean you don't know what they mean? But yet we'll see that that is a sign of true knowledge, of true wisdom, is to know your limitations. And until you've examined yourself, you're not going to understand what those limitations are. You're not going to be willing to admit to them. The other thing he's looking for is in all of these attempted explanations and definitions, is there anything that is shared, that is common amongst all of them? Because if there is, then maybe that's the starting point. Maybe that's where we can begin to find a real definition for these things, to establish real knowledge. And so that's the method that Socrates teaches. That's the method that eventually is going to lead to him getting into quite a bit of trouble. This is just really funny. Plato being created through Plato. Now, I said we know primarily about Plato through the writing, or we know primarily about Socrates, rather, through the writings of Plato. There are a couple of other sources that mention him, but we know primarily through Plato. Now, when we look at Plato's work, we can divide it up into three major sections: the early dialogues, the middle, and the later dialogues. And this refers to when Plato writes them during his lifetime. So the early dialogues is written when Plato is younger, the middle during the middle part of his life, and the later towards the end of Plato's life. Now, what we notice is that there is a lot of difference in the way that these writings are taking place. Much of what you're going to be looking at in this course comes from the early dialogues. And the early dialogues, there are four together that tell us the story of the trial and death of Socrates, basically the end of Socrates' life. And these are the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo. The Euthyphro we're not going to deal with in this class, but basically this is when Socrates is first being called into court to answer charges that are eventually going to lead to his death. On the steps on his way in, he runs into Euthyphro. There's a conversation that ensues, which is interesting in its own right, but we're not going to get into that. We are going to look at the other three. The Apology, which in Greek, apologia means defense. So this is basically his defense trial. The Crito takes place while Socrates is in prison waiting his execution. And the Phaedo is going to talk about the final conversation that Socrates has with his friends leading up to his execution. Now, these early dialogues are, despite what they're talking about, are very nice, very easy to read. They are friendly. And we see a Socrates who is very jovial, who is very playful. I mean, here's a guy who is on trial for his life, but yet he seems to be enjoying himself. He's having fun with the situation. He's not lamenting, he's not crying, he's not trying desperately to get out of it. He's accepting what is happening. He's playing with his audience. He's having a good time. And we see this very jovial, happy type of Socrates there. We also find, particularly in the Crito, that Socrates seems to be an individual who believes very firmly in the idea of democracy. And he's willing to accept the death sentence that has been passed down on him because it's the will of the people. And so he feels that democracy is it. But then there's a transition that takes place when we get to the middle dialogues. In the middle dialogues, such as the Republic, we find a Socrates who is not as jovial or playful as he was before. We find an individual who is perhaps a little more jaded towards things. And we also see a transition in his form of thinking. Socrates will refer to democracy as the lowest form of government, nothing but the mob rule of the ignorant. And that's very different from what we saw in those earlier dialogues. And then, of course, by the time you get to the later dialogues, these things are almost a nightmare to read and get through, quite honestly. The playfulness, the fun of it is gone. And Socrates becomes nothing but an individual who is very arrogant and sure of his ways, somebody who wants to really push his view onto everyone else. Why is there such a strange transition that takes place here? Well, my belief and that of several others, though not uniformly accepted, is that the Plato in those early dialogues is giving us a true depiction of Socrates, his teacher. He is very close to this moment. The trial is taking place, the death of Socrates is taking place, and Plato is very close to that. And so what Plato ends up doing is to sort of say, look, I'm going to tell you this is what happens. This is what he talked about. I think we're getting the true Socrates in that moment. But when we move on to these later dialogues, I think Socrates is being transformed into a literary character, into a being that is there not as a real depiction, but as a proxy for Plato. I think when we look at these middle and later dialogues, we are getting Plato's views simply being put into the mouth of Socrates. Why? Because Plato saw what happened to Socrates, and he doesn't want that to happen to him. So, instead of coming forward boldly, these are my views, and potentially getting himself put on trial and executed, he says, all I'm doing is acting as a historian. I'm recording what Socrates has said. And by putting it onto the mouth or into the mouth of this other person, Plato is able to protect himself, his own character, his own interest. Because of this type of transition and change, some people have actually questioned whether Socrates even really existed. And the general consensus is that he did, although there are some people who argue that maybe he didn't. Maybe he was just a composite. Maybe he always was just a literary character. But I think that he is real. And not only this transition here that we're talking about, an inconsistency in Socrates, in Plato's writings, not just that makes me think so, but also when we look at the other two writings. One of the other places where Socrates is mentioned is in the playwright Aristophanes' work, The Clouds. And in The Clouds, Socrates is ridiculed. He's made fun of. He's supposedly going to create this place called a thinkery, in which he teaches individuals that up is down and left is right, and so on. This is where the idea of him being a sophist is being played out. The other work is the historian Heraclitus, who makes a very brief mention, again in a very mocking, very ridiculing fashion, of Socrates. Now, if you are going to take the time to make fun and ridicule an individual, doesn't it seem likely that that person exists? You're not going to ridicule somebody that's a fictional entity. You're not going to make fun of a being that doesn't exist. You're only going to lampoon somebody who is actually real. And so I think that in and of itself really feeds us to the point that Socrates is in fact a very real individual. But again, that we're seeing the real Socrates in these early dialogues, and we're seeing Plato coming through in Socrates' voice and his guise in those later dialogues. All right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video at this point, and in the next one we'll go ahead and move into Plato's Apology and take a look at that.